materials and turn things over to the very first presenter, Kristen Fitzgerald, who's going to be joining us again from EPA's Office of Resource Conservation and Recovery. And with that, Kristen, feel free to begin.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jean, and welcome, everybody. Happy Valentine's Day. So we are about a month late, thanks to the furlough in doing this presentation, but we're finally here to present our first webinar, and we're very glad you could join us all. So we're going to get started, dive right in. As you may have noticed, the rule package comes in at nearly 500 pages, so we have a lot to talk about. But I do want to point out that at this stage, we really only have time to cover the rule at a pretty high level, and we don't dive into a lot of detail in many areas. But rest assured, in the coming months, we will do longer format training that will allow us to take a deeper dive past the intro that we're going to be doing today. So here's the outline for today's presentation. Maybe not be readily apparent but from the outline, but the bulk of our presentation today will be going over the various provisions of Subpart P. That'll be about 2/3 of the presentation. Let's talk about the goals of the pharmaceutical rule. I actually like to think of the PHARMS rule as 3 rules in one. As it was finalized. And the first rule being what we refer to as Subpart P, kind of the bulk of the PHARMS rule, and that helps create regulations that are better fit for the healthcare sector, eliminates the intentional sewering of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, a measure that I think is long overdue, and it reduces overlapping regulations where we've been able to do that, most notably with DEA and FDA regulations. And the second part of the rule is, fulfilling our commitment that we made in the 2016 retail strategy, which is to provide regulatory clarity and national consistency on how RCRA applies to reverse distribution and reverse logistics. And finally, kind of the third part of the rule is an amendment to Part 261, the amendment to the listing for nicotine for PO75 listing, to provide regulatory relief to healthcare facilities that are strictly regulated as large quantity generators, even when they're generating small amounts of nicotine replacement therapy. So we'll go over all those kind of 3 parts of the rulemaking, but spend the bulk of the time on Subpart P, like I mentioned. So the first thing, we're going to do things a little backwards. The first thing we're going to do is talk about the effective dates and state adoption. We usually do this later in the presentation, but I just wanted folks to realize, like right up front, before they hear all the detail of the rule and get a little nervous about things, that right up front, in most cases, there's substantial time before the rule is effective in your state. Federally, the rule is effective 6 months after publication in the Federal Register. And I'm very happy to report that we learned yesterday afternoon, after I turned in the slides, in fact, that publication has been scheduled now for February 22nd, which is next Friday. So it's not set in stone, but we anticipate that publication of the rule will be in the Federal Register February 22nd, next Friday. But even though the rule is out and will soon be published, we can't implement the rule yet. Okay? Because for most provisions, the rule is not effective in authorized states until the state adopts it. Now, because this is RCRA, there is an exception to that, and I will get into that. Let's talk about the effective date for the nicotine listing first. The amendment to the nicotine listing is effective 6 months after publication in the Federal Register, but only in a few locations, only in non-authorized states, Indian country, and U.S. territories. So assuming the rule is in fact published next week, that means the effective date will be in August of 2019, federally in those non-authorized states. Now once effective, this amendment amends Part 261, the listing for PO75. So this change is applies to any generator of the over-the-counter nicotine replacement therapies, and it's not really limited to healthcare facilities and reverse distributors. Remember, though, in authorized states, it's a different story. So the amendment to the nicotine listing is effective only after a state adopts the amendment. And this amendment to the nicotine listing is obviously considered less stringent than the current program. So therefore, authorized states are not required to adopt the amendment, and they have no deadline to adopt the amendment. We do expect most states will pick it up, but they're not required to, and they have no schedule to. Let's move on to actual Subpart P effective dates. Like nicotine, Subpart P is effective 6 months after publication in the Federal Register, but only in those non-authorized states and Indian country and U.S. territories. So again, that puts the effective date in August, but only for those few locations. So as with nicotine, in authorized states, Subpart P is only effective after the state adopts Subpart P. But what's different from nicotine is that on the whole, we've determined that Subpart P is actually considered more stringent. So therefore, authorized states are required to adopt it. And we really are hopeful that this will promote the request for national consistency that we heard from many stakeholders. Now, assuming the final rule is published in February next week, that starts the clock for the authorized states to adopt the rule. So authorized states will have until July 1st, 2021 to adopt Subpart P, unless they require statutory amendment, and that means they would have until July 1st, 2022. So, like I said, with RCRA, there are always exceptions to everything, and the exception here is the sewer prohibition in the rule. And although it is part of Subpart P, it's a little bit different than the rest of Subpart P. So the prohibition on sewering hazardous waste pharmaceuticals is promulgated under the authority of HAzMAt, the Hazardous and Solid Waste Amendments. Those are 1984 amendments to RCRA. So I'm sure you're asking yourselves, really, why do I care that this is a HAzMAt amendment and not a standard RCRA amendment? Well, it matters because it affects state adoption and authorization process. So it means, like all HAzMAt provisions, the sewer prohibition is effective in all states 6 months after publication in the Federal Register, regardless of whether the state is authorized and regardless of whether the state is adopted. So that means for the sewer ban only, the effective date for the sewer prohibition will be August 2019 for all the states. That's the one exception that everybody's got to get ready for sooner rather than later. A lot of the other stuff will follow. So this is a timeline format of the same information we just discussed about effective dates and state adoption. As I'll probably say several times during the course of today, I'm a visual learner. I've got a lot of diagrams that we're going to go through today. I find it very helpful. I hope you do too. So as you notice, I've got a big question mark here for publication because I handed in the slides yesterday and then learned in the afternoon that we've got this scheduled for February 22nd. So that'll make it August of 2019 where the sewer ban is effective in all states, and then nicotine amendment and Subpart P will be effective in the few non-authorized states. But then we've got almost 2 years until the states have to actually have their deadlines for adopting it. Now, despite those 2 years, we do expect that many states will adopt the rules before the deadlines, and many typically do. New Jersey and Pennsylvania always follow right after the Fed. But we actually, in this case, think that some others will be quick on this rule just because they've been so interested and have already talked to us in some cases. So Vermont, for example, Washington, state of Washington, I'm thinking maybe Connecticut. So I don't think in many cases the states will take the 2 years, but in some cases I'm sure they will. Okay, let's dive into the rule itself. We'll be starting with a brief discussion of the nicotine listing amendment. I think this takes up about 20 or 30 pages in the preamble, but we're going to give it 2 slides, so we're going to move right through this really quickly. So like I said, it amends Part 261 of the regulations. It's separate from Subpart P and applies to any generator. So as I'm sure many of you are keenly, or perhaps maybe you would say acutely aware, nicotine is an acute hazardous waste listed as PO75. And this final rule amends that PO75 listing for nicotine such that FDA-approved, over-the-counter, nicotine replacement therapies will no longer be included in the listing. So that's kind of a mouthful, so I usually prefer to say the acronym version of that, which is FDA, OTC, NRT. That's the NRTs and the OTCs, those are FDA terms, of course. So EPA has concluded that nicotine patches, gums, and lozenges do not meet the regulatory criteria for the acute hazardous waste listing. That means after this rule is effective, that nicotine patches and gums and lozenges can be discarded as non-hazardous waste. Although in the preamble I will note that we include some recommended best management practices to prevent access to those in the trash. I want to make sure everyone realizes, though, that nicotine will continue to be a listed acute hazardous waste with the waste code P075. It's still there, it belongs there. And that means that other unused formulations of nicotine will still be considered P075 when discarded. And that will include e-cigarettes, e-juices, cartridges, the vials. And Laura, my colleague, will elaborate on that when she's discussing the definition of pharmaceutical a little bit later. And although the nicotine-containing pesticides are no longer registered, there are legacy pesticides around containing nicotine, and then, of course, nicotine is used in research and manufacturing, notably the manufacturing of cigarettes. So those will all still be considered P075, the acute listed hazardous waste. Okay, so now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Laura Stanley, for a bit, and she'll take you through the next section.
So as Christian mentioned, one of the goals of this final rule is to provide clarity and national consistency surrounding reverse distribution and reverse logistics. For the final rule, we have adopted the terminology suggested by commenters and distinguished between reverse distribution and reverse logistics. So under the final rule, reverse distribution refers to the process where prescription pharmaceuticals are sent to a reverse distributor where they are evaluated to see if they will get manufacturer's credit. Reverse logistics, on the other hand, refers to the process where non-prescription pharmaceuticals, including over-the-counters, supplements, and other retail items, are sent to a reverse logistics center and evaluated to see if they'll be reused or reclaimed. Commenters on the proposed rule noted that there is a difference in the reverse flow process for prescription pharmaceuticals and non-prescription pharmaceuticals and other retail items. Non-prescription pharmaceuticals and other unsold retail items are sent to reverse logistics centers where they are evaluated to see if they can be reused, so liquidated, sold on the secondary market, or sent for reclamation. In this rule, we finalized that non-prescription pharmaceuticals and other unsold retail items will not be considered waste at the healthcare facility or the retail facility if they have a reasonable expectation of being reused or reclaimed. So this is a visual representation of the reverse flow process for non-prescription pharmaceuticals and other retail items. So if there's a reasonable expectation of use, reuse, or reclamation, the healthcare or retail facility can send them to a reverse logistics center to see if they'll be donated, sold, recycled, repaired. If the reverse logistics center decides the items cannot actually be used or reused or reclaimed for some reason, then they need to be properly disposed of as hazardous waste by the reverse logistics center. If the non-prescription pharmaceuticals and other unsold retail items have no reasonable expectation of reuse or reclamation, they need to be disposed of as hazardous waste by the healthcare facility or retail facility. EPA has had a long-standing policy that pharmaceuticals that are sent to a reverse distributor are not considered waste at the retail store, but this policy assumed that the pharmaceuticals have the potential to be recycled or reused after they are evaluated for credit. EPA wrote in our policy in 1991 that this assumption was based on the idea that reverse distribution was established to facilitate the recycling and reuse of pharmaceuticals. And as I've already described, non-prescription pharmaceuticals and other unsold retail items are regularly sent to reverse logistics centers where they are evaluated to see if they can be reused or reclaimed. Thus, they can be sent from the retail store to the reverse logistics center and will not be considered waste until the reverse logistics center makes the decision to discard. On the other hand, commenters in the proposed rule confirm that prescription pharmaceuticals that are sent to reverse distributors where they are evaluated for manufacturer's credit are not reused, reclaimed, or resold, and rather are discarded. Reverse distributors receive the prescription pharmaceuticals from healthcare facilities and facilitate the process of crediting healthcare facilities for these unused pharmaceuticals. However, they are not liquidated, donated, or sent for reclamation. They are discarded by the reverse distributor. Thus, this final rule maintains the position that prescription pharmaceuticals moving through reverse distribution are wastes at the healthcare facility. The fact that these hazardous waste pharmaceuticals do have value in the form of manufacturer's credit has allowed us to take a more flexible regulatory approach. And closer to the end of the presentation, I'll talk more about the standards for these pharmaceuticals at reverse distributors. And here's a visual representation of the reverse flow process for prescription pharmaceuticals. A healthcare retail facility can send the potentially credible hazardous waste pharmaceuticals to a reverse distributor if they have a reasonable expectation of receiving credit from the manufacturer. The healthcare facility and reverse distributors must manage these potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals under the new Subpart P standards in the final rule. The reverse distributor then evaluates the pharmaceuticals, and if they need to be sent to another reverse distributor for further evaluation, they're still considered potentially creditable. But otherwise, they become evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, and the reverse distributor must ultimately send them for hazardous waste disposal. At the healthcare facility, a retail facility generates prescription hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that have no reasonable expectation of receiving credit from the manufacturer. These are considered non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, and they must be sent straight for hazardous waste disposal. And I'll elaborate more on potentially credible versus non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals in a few minutes. All right, so we really just want to hammer home the point that in this final rule, we are recognizing a key distinction in the industry between reverse distribution and reverse logistics. Reverse distribution refers to the process where prescription pharmaceuticals are sent to a reverse distributor where they're evaluated for manufacturer's credit. They're not reused, reclaimed, or sold, and are rather discarded by the reverse distributor. These prescription pharmaceuticals are considered solid waste at the healthcare retail facility, and the hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that are sent to reverse distributors must be managed under Subpart P. We codified this policy on reverse distribution in Subpart P, so this means it won't be effective in non-authorized states until 6 months after publication, and for authorized states, it will become effective when the state adopts Subpart P. Reverse logistics, on the other hand, refers to the process where non-prescription pharmaceuticals and other unsold retail items are sent to a reverse logistics center where they're evaluated to see if they will be reused, so liquidated or sold on the secondary market, or sent for reclamation. In this rule, we finalized that non-prescription pharmaceuticals and other unsold retail items will not be considered waste at the healthcare or retail facility if they have a reasonable expectation of being reused or reclaimed. We codified this in Subpart P, and it affirms existing policy and therefore is effective immediately at the federal level. But states have taken a variety of positions on reverse logistics, so please check with your state to confirm their policy. All right, so we're going to run an overview of Subpart P and the regulations for the management of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals by healthcare facilities and reverse distributors. We've defined a lot of new terms under Subpart P. In particular, the definitions of pharmaceutical and healthcare facility determine who is allowed to operate under Subpart P and what those folks are allowed to manage under Subpart P. So the definition of pharmaceutical is derived from FDA's definition of drug, but we went a little further and we also included dietary supplements, electronic nicotine delivery systems, and liquid nicotine packaged for retail. Kristen walked us through the new exemption for FDA-approved OTC NRTs and pointed out that electronic cigarettes and vaping pens are not part of that exemption. However, they are included in the final definition of pharmaceutical so that healthcare facilities can have the benefits of managing them under Subpart P. Note that for liquid nicotine, this only includes the pre-filled cartridges that are packaged for retail. It doesn't include the bulk liquid nicotine that a vaping store might use to mix its own e-liquids for sale. Here's a longer list of what is considered a pharmaceutical in the final rule. You'll notice some things in there we don't traditionally think of as a pharmaceutical, like personal protective equipment or dietary supplements. But we included these items because we want healthcare facilities to be able to manage their common hazardous waste streams under the same standards. On the right-hand side, you'll see the things that are not included under the final definition of pharmaceutical. We explicitly exclude dental amalgam from the definition because there's another EPA rule from Office of Water that addresses dental amalgam. A hazardous waste pharmaceutical is a pharmaceutical that is a solid waste and exhibits one or more characteristics or is listed. And as I pointed out earlier, a non-prescription pharmaceutical is not a solid waste and thus not a hazardous waste pharmaceutical if it has a reasonable expectation of being legitimately used, reused, or reclaimed and is being sent to a reverse logistics center. There are three types of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that are defined under Subpart P: non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceutical, potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceutical, and evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceutical. So non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals are the hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that have no expectation of receiving manufacturer's credit. For example, cleanup material from spills of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals or contaminated PPE. These are hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that clearly have no possibility of getting manufacturer's credit. These must be sent for hazardous waste disposal and cannot be sent to a reverse distributor. On the other hand, a potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceutical is a prescription hazardous waste pharmaceutical that has a reasonable expectation of receiving manufacturer's credit, and these can be sent to a reverse distributor for evaluation. These have to have a reasonable expectation of receiving credit and meet three criteria. They have to be in original manufacturer packaging, unless they are recalls. They must be undispensed, and they must be unexpired or less than 1 year past expiration. It's important to note that healthcare facilities do not need to know when hazardous waste pharmaceuticals are going to end up actually getting credit. The reverse distributor is the one who knows the credit policies of the manufacturers and can really make the determination of when pharmaceuticals get credit. Rather, these have to have a reasonable expectation of receiving credit. The non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals are the ones that the healthcare facility knows won't get credit and should not go to the reverse distributor. So again, something like cleanup material from spills or contaminated PPE would be an example. All right, so after the reverse distributor receives the potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals and evaluates them and determines if credit should be issued, they become evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, and they need to be managed as evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceuticals and ultimately sent for hazardous waste disposal. If the reverse distributor decides they need to be sent to another reverse distributor for further evaluation of manufacturer's credit, they can send them as potentially credible hazardous waste pharmaceuticals to the next reverse distributor. Under the final rule, the definition of healthcare facility includes things we traditionally think of as a healthcare facility, like hospitals, dentists, doctors' offices, but it also includes retailers like pharmacies because we want them to be able to manage their hazardous waste pharmaceuticals under Subpart P. Here's a longer list of what is considered a healthcare facility under the final rule. We also included wholesale distributors in the final definition because we want to ensure they can continue sending potentially credible hazardous waste pharmaceuticals to reverse distributors. It also includes things like veterinary clinics, chiropractors, long-term care facilities, but it does not include pharmaceutical manufacturers, reverse distributors, or reverse logistics centers. As I mentioned, the definition of healthcare facility also includes long-term care facilities. Long-term care facilities include nursing homes and hospice facilities, but it does not include assisted living facilities or independent living communities. Originally in the proposed rule, we did include assisted living facilities in the definition of long-term care facility, but we did not include in the final definition or in order to be more consistent with the definitions that DEA uses and that the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services uses. So I've talked a lot about the functions of a reverse distributor already, but the final rule defines a reverse distributor as a person who receives prescription pharmaceuticals for the purpose of facilitating or verifying manufacturer's credit. This can include forward distributors and manufacturers. If they are processing prescription pharmaceuticals to verify them for credit, they are considered a reverse distributor under the rule. So that covers the main terms defined under the rule. I'm going to hand it back to Kristen, and she'll talk about applicability under the final rule.
Okay, so as we discuss the remaining slides, our job is to fill in this chart with provisions of Subpart T. Just so you know, this is obviously a small chart. It's not an exhaustive list of all the provisions, just a few highlights that kind of give you the shape of the rule. And I think even without even with just the headers right now, the blank chart, you can kind of see that the regulations depends on two things. First, the type of facility, whether it's a healthcare facility or whether it's a reverse distributor. And the other thing it depends upon is the type of hazardous waste pharmaceutical, whether it's potentially creditable or whether it's non-creditable / evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceutical. All right, so we'll gradually fill this in until it's filled at the end of the presentation. First, I'm going to talk about the applicability of the rule. And as I mentioned earlier, Subpart T is considered more stringent. And that means it's not optional. It's not optional for the states to adopt it, but it's also not optional for the healthcare facilities and reverse distributors. And this is a little unusual. Most of our other alternative rules are optional, like universal waste, for example, but this is not. And so once this is effective, hazardous waste pharmaceuticals must be managed under Part 266 Subpart P by all the healthcare facilities that generate above VSPG limits of hazardous waste, as well as all reverse distributors. Subpart P is also unique in that it's a waste-specific and a sector-specific rule. So it does not apply to the management of hazardous waste that aren't pharmaceuticals. Maybe lab waste, for example, at a healthcare facility, or maintenance waste at a healthcare facility. Those aren't going to be managed under Subpart P. It's a waste-specific rulemaking. And it's a sector-specific rulemaking, so hazardous waste, pharmaceuticals generated by folks that aren't healthcare facilities or reverse distributors also aren't subject to the rules. For example, manufacturers. So healthcare facilities and reverse distributors are only managing their pharmaceuticals under Subpart P, so that means they're going to have potentially more than one RCRA that they're going to have to comply with. So they'll have Part 262, the standard generator regulations under Part 262 for the management of their non-pharmaceutical hazardous waste, or if they have universal waste, they might have to comply with 273. Or if they have used oil, they'll have to comply with 279. So you can see this rule is only for hazardous waste pharmaceuticals and only at healthcare facilities and reverse distributors. So assuming you are subject to Subpart P, you figured out that you are a healthcare facility or a reverse distributor managing hazardous waste pharmaceuticals and you're subject to Subpart P, now you can kind of toss out RCRA as you know it, and there are no generator categories under Part 266 Subpart P. All healthcare facilities are regulated the same for their hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, and then all reverse distributors are regulated the same for their hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. So the good news is that means that healthcare facilities and reverse distributors operating under Subpart P don't have to keep track of how many hazardous waste pharmaceuticals they generate per month, because there are no generator sets. They don't have to segregate their acute and the non-acute. So we're very hopeful that this will provide an incentive for folks to overmanage their non-hazardous pharmaceuticals as hazardous without having to worry about bumping up in generator category and incurring additional regulations associated with that. Right now, if a healthcare facility overmanages their non-hazardous pharmaceuticals as hazardous, then they have to worry about becoming an LPG, and that brings down a bunch of additional regulations. This will eliminate that episodic generation. So new to the final rule is a long list of pharmaceuticals that are not subject to RCRA regulation, at least initially anyway. So we've added this for clarity, and also there are some changes that have been made in response to some comments that we received. So as Laura already discussed, the first couple of those items, pharmaceuticals are not solid waste they're not subject to RCRA regulation if they're not solid waste because they're being legitimately used or reused or reclaimed. This is basically to accommodate donations. Secondly, OTC pharmaceuticals or non-prescription pharmaceuticals have a reasonable expectation of being legitimately used, reused, or reclaimed. Laura's already discussed that at length. So I'm going to focus on the next four. So recalled pharmaceuticals, pharmaceuticals under preservation order or during investigation or judicial proceeding, and investigational new drugs. You see a little asterisk after those. So in those cases, what we're basically doing is deferring to other regulatory agencies initially, primarily FDA, to avoid duplicative or perhaps even contradictory regulations. But I do want to point out that that asterisk says that RCRA will apply eventually. When the other agencies kind of leave off, then we're going to pick up, and the pharmaceuticals, when they have to be discarded, will be subject to Subpart P at that point. And then the sixth one, the household waste pharmaceuticals, we wanted to add that for additional clarity to point out. We've written this in several memos, but we just wanted to codify it to make sure everybody's aware of it, that they're still exempt as household hazardous waste. And there is one exception to that, which we'll discuss a little bit later, but the exception is that when they're collected, we specify a treatment and destruction method. We use the term treatment, but DEA uses the term destruction. So when the household pharmaceuticals are collected by a DEA registrant in compliance with DEA regulations, they will have to follow those treatment conditions that we specify in 266-506, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Okay, so here we go. The diagrammatic version of what we've been talking about here. So we've diagrammed out the applicability for both the RX and the non-RX pharmaceuticals as they kind of move through this whole process. So first let's do the prescription pharmaceuticals. And here are the three types of the hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that Laura just discussed a moment ago, the non-creditable, the potentially creditable, and the evaluated. So in all cases, for prescription pharmaceuticals, Subpart P is going to apply, and that's all new, right? So in all phases, Subpart P is what's going to regulate these. And the reverse distributors, for the evaluated pharmaceuticals, their hazardous waste consists almost exclusively of pharmaceuticals. They might have a few non-pharmaceutical waste that would be subject to Part 262, likely would be a VSTG for those pharmaceuticals. So we thought it was more appropriate because the bulk of their hazardous waste are pharmaceuticals, that they would be regulated under Subpart P for pharmaceuticals. But for non-prescription pharmaceuticals, it's a very different story. So for the over-the-counter kind of non-creditable pharmaceuticals, they will be subject to Part 266 Subpart P, and this is new. And this allows the healthcare facilities to manage all their hazardous waste pharmaceuticals together in the same way when they're discarded and destined for a TSBF, right? So they won't have to, put their OTCs in under Part 262 and their prescriptions under Part 266. That didn't make sense. So they can all be managed under Subpart P as hazardous waste pharmaceuticals together. But as Laura has mentioned, the ones going to a reverse logistics center, those are, if there's a reasonable expectation of use, reuse, or reclamation, those are not solid waste, therefore they're not hazardous waste, therefore RCRA doesn't apply, and that's kind of status quo, and that's not new. And likewise, when a reverse logistics center sends it to a TSDF, the status quo will remain. They're going to be subject to Part 262 for the disposal of those hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. Now, unlike reverse distributors, reverse logistics centers have many types of hazardous waste besides the pharmaceuticals, so we thought 262 applicability was more appropriate to apply to them. And now I'm going to hand it back to Laura to talk about the healthcare facility standards.
All right. We finalized standards tailored specifically for healthcare facilities under Subpart P. The healthcare facility standards are generally modeled after the universal waste regulations, while the reverse distributor standards, which I will discuss a little later on, are modeled after the LPG standards for the most part. First, all healthcare facilities must submit a one-time notification within 60 days of their state adopting the rule. Facilities that submit a biennial report can comply by notifying during their normal biennial report cycle. So facilities in non-authorized states that do not have to submit a biennial report will need to submit notifications in October of 2019. Facilities in non-authorized states that do have to submit a biennial report will need to submit notifications with their March 2020 biennial report. For training, we finalized performance-based standards that require personnel to be familiar with the proper waste handling and emergency procedures. Under the final rule, healthcare facilities have to do hazardous waste determinations and determine whether a waste pharmaceutical is a hazardous waste pharmaceutical. Healthcare facilities do have the option, though, of managing all of their waste pharmaceuticals as hazardous waste, in which case individual hazardous waste determinations are not necessary. This provides an incentive for healthcare facilities to overmanage non-hazardous waste pharmaceuticals as hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. Healthcare facilities can also commingle their hazardous waste pharmaceuticals and their non-hazardous waste pharmaceuticals in the same container. So the management standards are different for non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals and potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. For the non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, healthcare facilities have to label accumulation containers with the words hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, but they don't need hazardous waste codes on the containers. They have to be accumulated in closed containers that are structurally sound, and they can be accumulated for up to a year. Potentially credible hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, on the other hand, do not have labeling requirements, they don't have container standards, and they don't have accumulation time limits. And this chart just lays out the standards for non-creditable and potentially credible hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. The only thing I haven't mentioned so far, I think, is that healthcare facilities don't need to include any of their hazardous waste pharmaceuticals on their biennial report. And again, because as Kristen said, we're visual learners, here's another summary matrix that kind of just compares the potentially credible standards and the non-credible standards. And I'm going to hand it back to Kristen to talk about VSQGs.
So the way the rights are written, there's a separate section set out for the VSQG healthcare facility. And generally, healthcare facilities that are VSQGs are not subject to Part 266 of Part P, with one notable exception, the sewer ban. And so as such, they can make a couple of choices. They can either choose to opt into Subpart P and then comply with all of its provisions and take advantage of all of its provisions, or they can not be under Subpart P and just use, pick and choose whether to use any or all of the optional provisions specifically designed for VSQG healthcare facilities. So those four provisions are, one, VSQG healthcare facility can continue to send its potentially credible hazardous waste pharmaceuticals to a reverse distributor. In this case, because they're not subject to Subpart P, the tracking would not apply for those shipments to a reverse distributor. The second provision for VSQG healthcare facilities is that they can send their hazardous waste pharmaceuticals off-site to another healthcare facility. And this is a variation of the generator improvements rule provision for off-site consolidation. So the VSPG would have to send it to a healthcare facility, and the receiving healthcare facility would either have to be operating under Subpart P and meet certain conditions, or they could use the generator rule off-site consolidation and meet the conditions under there. We've left that open to them, which way they want to do that. Maybe they're consolidating other things along with their pharmaceuticals, and they'd want to use the Part 262 so they can do it all together. Maybe they only have pharmaceuticals, and then they probably use the Subpart P consolidation. And then there are two more optional provisions for VSPGs, but they're only for long-term care facilities. The first one is that a long-term care facility that the VSPG can dispose of its hazardous waste pharmaceuticals if they have an on-site collection receptacle that complies with the DEA regulations. I'm not sure how many of these actually exist at this point, but if the long-term care facility has the retail pharmacy that's installed one of these DEA receptacles, they can put their hazardous waste pharmaceuticals in there. Now, I will note you need to be careful about this one. It's a little bit tricky because the DEA collection receptacles, of course, by the DEA regulations, only allows for the collection of controlled substances that are from the ultimate user. Okay, but the DEA does allow for commingling of controlled and non-controlled, and so a VSPG healthcare facility could put hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that are non-controlled into the on-site receptacle. We feel this is preferable to the alternative of putting it in the solid waste trash waste stream. And then the fourth optional provision is that a long-term care facility with 20 beds or fewer will be presumed to be a VSPG and not subject to Subpart P, except for the sewer ban. And I will note, some people are a little bit confused about this. It's just a matter of kind of the burden of proof, right? A VSPG with more than 20 beds may well be, a healthcare facility, long-term care facility may well be a VSPG, even if it has more than 20 beds. It's just kind of a matter of who has to prove it, right? A VSPG with more than 20 beds has to actually actively demonstrate that they are VSPGs, whereas a long-term care facility with fewer than 20 beds will not. They will automatically be presumed to be a VSPG. So we kind of had to make that number a little bit conservative, but certainly, folks have said, well, I know, long-term care facility with 50 beds that's a VSPG. Well, that may well be the case, but they're going to have to demonstrate that. All right, so next I'm going to discuss, you have three sections of the rule that apply more broadly. A lot of the rights we've been talking about are either for healthcare facilities, and Laura's going to talk about reverse distributor standards later, but I'm going to talk about several provisions that apply to both. So first, as I've mentioned several times already, there's the sewer prohibition. So I'm very happy that this rule is finalizing the sewer provision, the sewer prohibition. And it's going to make it so that hazardous waste pharmaceuticals may not be sewered any longer. And like I said earlier, I think this is long overdue. It's a rather common practice in some healthcare facilities, and I really think it needs to stop. So I think we've kind of invented a new word here, sewered. My spell check doesn't really like that word a whole lot, but I think you know what I mean. There's no putting it down the drain in any form, no flushing it, no putting it down the sink. Right? No sewering. So the sewer prohibition applies to all healthcare facilities, including healthcare facilities that are VSPGs, including healthcare facilities that are long-term care facilities. It also applies to all reverse distributors. Not that we think reverse distributors are necessarily sewering to the extent that healthcare facilities are, but still it does apply to them. It also applies to the hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that are DEA-controlled substances, including what DEA refers to as pharmaceutical wastage, meaning any leftovers in syringes. DEA calls that wastage, and they allow that to be sewered. We do not. And although the rule technically only applies to hazardous waste pharmaceuticals at healthcare facilities and reverse distributors, we do note that we strongly discourage the storing of any pharmaceutical by any entity. I also want to remind people that this is the one provision of the rule that will be effective in all states 6 months after publication. So we're looking at August of 2019. Right. The second kind of broadly applicable provision is related to DEA-controlled substances. And there are a handful of RCRA hazardous wastes that are also DEA-controlled substances. And until now, they've been subject to both sets of regulations. And so to remedy that, we created 2 new conditional exemptions for healthcare facilities and reverse distributors, where we're essentially deferring to the DEA regulations to avoid duplicative regulations. So more generally, the first one is that RCRA hazardous wastes that are also DEA-controlled substances will be conditionally exempt. And more specifically, in order to promote take-backs, the household waste pharmaceuticals collected in the DEA authorized collection receptacles are also conditionally exempt. So I discussed this a little earlier. Household waste pharmaceuticals remain completely exempt. Only the collected household pharmaceuticals have to meet the conditions. And that's actually largely driven by the fact that DEA regulations require the collected household pharmaceuticals to meet the non-retrievable standards. As I mentioned, there are only a handful of RCRA hazardous wastes that are also DEA-controlled substances. This list may not be exhaustive, but we did ask commenters to identify the 5 that we identified in the proposal, or identify any additional beyond the 5 that we identified in the proposal, and we still ended up with the same 5 after comments. So we think we've got them all, but we're not 100% sure. So anyway, I guess some people sometimes ask, what do we mean by a conditional exemption? And so what we mean is that in both cases, the hazardous waste pharmaceuticals are exempt from RCRA provided they comply with the conditions related to the treatment and destruction. So first of all, they can't be sewered. Right? I think we're all pretty clear on that. No more sewering of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. Okay, the justification for this is that we're referring to the DEA regulations, so obviously you have to comply with the DEA regulations as one of the conditions. And then it has to be destroyed in one of 2 ways. It has to either be destroyed by a method that the DEA has publicly deemed in writing to meet their non-retrievable standards, or it has to be combusted at one of the following types of permitted combustors, either a large or small municipal waste combustor, a HAMWE, a SISWE, or a hazardous waste combustor. So we realized that the DEA has been reluctant so far to state one way or another what technology meets their non-retrievable standards. But we really felt like we had to push the envelope a little bit here and say that the DEA has to publicly put something in writing about whether they think something meets the non-retrievable standard, because we're concerned about companies making unsubstantiated claims of meeting DEA's non-retrievable standards, and therefore folks being able to use that to get around RCRA. So until they are willing to put it in writing, I think folks are mostly going to have to rely upon combustion. And we did expand the list of combustors allowable in the final rule to maximize the options for destroying the take-back drugs. Now, this provision does not apply to VSPG healthcare facilities, unless, of course, they opt into Subpart P. But we also think it should be unnecessary for VSPGs, since federally VSPGs are largely exempt from RCRA anyway. They don't really need this conditional exemption. Okay, so the third and final provision I'm going to talk about are the new empty container standards. So these are specifically developed for the types of containers that are found in healthcare settings. And they apply to containers with hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, both acute and non-acute. So healthcare facilities, it'll apply to healthcare facilities and reverse distributors that are subject to Subpart P, because it does amend, there's a provision in Subpart P, but we also are amending 261.7 where the existing empty container standards live, and so it will also apply to anybody else with containers of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, not just reverse distributors in healthcare facilities. So as with the existing empty container standards in 261.7, residues remaining in, quote, RCRA empty containers are not regulated as hazardous waste. And this provision can be used to determine whether a healthcare facility is in fact subject to Subpart P. So, for example, a small healthcare facility might be able to remain a VSPG maybe if they're on the bubble between VSPG and not, they might be able to remain a VSPG if their containers are now considered liquid empty with these new standards. There are 4 different standards for the various types of containers found in healthcare facilities, and we will go through each of them one by one. We tried to make the new standards, kind of very easy, straightforward, easy to implement. The big change that I want to point out here, and I think that most people are very happy about, is that triple rinsing of containers with acute hazardous waste pharmaceuticals is no longer required or allowed to render one container RCRA empty. So let's go through the 4 types of containers one by one. First are the stock bottles or / dispensing bottles up to 1 liter or 10,000 pills, as well as the unit dose containers. So these are, your most commonly encountered types of containers in healthcare, and the unit dose containers would include, Dixie cups or souffle cups, blister packs, wrappers, packages, and there's a new standard, and basically you just have to simply remove the content. For acute and non-acute, the same standard, no triple rinsing. So a container could become empty in a couple of different ways. One, so the normal course of dispensing the contents to the patient, and eventually you're going to run out of it and it's empty. But the other one is, if for whatever reason you haven't dispensed it all to a patient, you could empty the contents into a hazardous waste accumulation container, and then the container would be considered empty and would not have to be managed as hazardous waste. So the second type of container are syringes. And again, this is a new standard that differs from existing guidance and regulation. And for syringes, you would have to fully depress the plunger for it to be considered empty. And again, that's for acute as well as non-acute. So again, the syringes can become empty in a couple of ways. One is, through the normal course of administering the syringe to the patient. But in a lot of cases, you don't necessarily need the whole dose to give to the patient. So you'll have some remaining contents, and those contents can be put into a hazardous waste accumulation container. What we're trying to stop by the sewer prohibition is that you cannot squirt the remaining contents down the sink to render a syringe empty. Okay, so you got to put it into a hazardous waste accumulation container or into the patient, not down the sink. So if the syringe is empty, then the RCRA does not apply to that syringe any longer, but you're likely going to have, sharp container regulations, medical waste disposal regulations, and so on. If the syringe is not empty, and you don't empty the contents, right, you haven't emptied the contents, not empty, RCRA will apply in addition to any sharp and medical waste regulations. Let's move on to the third type of container, IV bags. Again, this is a new standard, and we want to keep it real simple. So basically, it can be rendered empty by fully administering the contents to the patient. That's for non-acute as well as acute. Now, there's a little bit of a difference here. If you have not fully administered the contents to the patient, there's will also allow you to use the old standard for empty containers in 261.7. But for acute, that's not an option. You're not going to triple rinse an IV bag. So if it's not fully administered, the contents are not fully administered to the patient, then it's not RCRA empty. And it has to be managed as non-creditable hazardous waste. Okay. And finally, the fourth, which is kind of catch-all category of containers and delivery devices that might include like inhalers or nebulizers or tubes of creams or gels. We have not developed a new standard. You can use the old standard in 261.7 for the non-acute, but for the acute, there is no new standard. Basically, there is no definition of RCRA empty. They have to be managed as non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. I mean, it's very difficult to tell if these kinds of containers are empty, and virtually impossible to triple rinse them to get them RCRA empty. And we don't want you guys to triple rinse them and put the rinsate down the drain, so those would just have to be managed as non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. Okay, hand it over to Laura one more time, and we're getting towards the end. Hang in there.
All right, I'm going to talk very briefly about the shipping standards. For potentially credible hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, A hazardous waste manifest and transporter are not required. The healthcare facility or reverse distributor can just use the common carrier. The shipper must receive delivery confirmation, but electronic tracking systems are sufficient, so they could use the delivery confirmation services provided by the post office, UPS, FedEx, any common carrier. In the proposed rule, we required advance notice, where the healthcare facilities were required to notify the reverse distributors that they were sending them a shipment of potentially credible hazardous waste for pharmaceuticals. But we eliminated that requirement in the final rule. For non-creditable and evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, a hazardous waste manifest and transporter are required, and they need to go to a TSDF. The only difference is that healthcare facilities don't need a waste code on the manifest. They will just use the waste code farms on their manifest instead. Reverse distributors, on the other hand, will need to use the waste codes on their manifest. And here's the summary matrix with the shipping standards. So again, potentially credible hazardous waste pharmaceuticals kind of all have the same shipping standards regardless of whether it's a healthcare facility or a reverse distributor. For the non-credible hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, healthcare facilities use the code FARM instead of the traditional waste code on the manifest, but reverse distributors do need to use waste codes on their manifest for evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. All right, so I'm going to move on to the reverse distributor standards. We finalized tailored standards for reverse distributors under the final rule. So reverse distributors are considered a new type of hazardous waste management facility that can accept potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. So they don't need a permit, but there are also no generator categories for reverse distributors. They're all considered the same thing under Subpart B. The standards are very similar to the standards for LKGs, as I mentioned, but there are a few additions, such as, they have to inventory the hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, and there are security requirements for the hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. We did finalize a maximum number of transfers between reverse distributors to prevent endless transfers of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. The potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals can go to multiple reverse distributors, but if they're hazardous waste, they ultimately need to go to a TSDF for hazardous waste disposal. As long as manufacturer's credit still needs to be verified and the hazardous waste pharmaceuticals are destined for another reverse distributor, they are still considered potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. Because potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals still have value before they are evaluated for credit, we're able to take a lighter regulatory approach for those potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. However, once manufacturer's credit has been verified, they are considered evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. And now that the value has been realized, the regulations become more robust for the evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. So we increased the accumulation time for reverse distributors between the proposed rule and the final rule. So under the final rule, a reverse distributor must inventory and evaluate each potentially credible hazardous waste pharmaceutical it receives within 30 days to determine if it needs to go to another reverse distributor or if it will go to a TSDF. The 180-day accumulation time limit doesn't begin until after the reverse distributor evaluates the pharmaceuticals. So in total, they can accumulate hazardous waste pharmaceuticals for 210 days. For potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that are destined for another reverse distributor, there are no specific labeling or container standards. And these don't need to be included in the reverse distributor's biannual report. On the other hand, evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that are destined for a TSDF have more robust regulations. The reverse distributor needs to designate an on-site accumulation area and conduct weekly inspections of the accumulation area. For personnel evaluating, handling the evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, the training standards are the same as large quantity generator training standards. They need to be labeled as hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, and the containers need to be in good condition. And hazardous waste codes are required prior to transportation off-site. Their distributor also needs to include the evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceuticals on their biennial report. So here's the summary matrix for the reverse distributor standards that kind of sums up what I've discussed, which is that once the potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals become evaluated, they're considered evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, and the more robust LQG-like standards kick in for those pharmaceuticals. And just for your reference, here's another matrix that shows the accumulation time for reverse distributors. They have to evaluate the potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals in 30 days, and they can accumulate the evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceuticals for an additional 180 days after evaluation. So we've finally filled out the entire summary matrix for Subpart P, and I'm going to hand it back to Kristen for her to wrap up.
Great, thanks, Laura. We just have a couple more slides. Just hang in there. We just want to leave you with the reminder that the rule is out. It's been signed since December and on our website, and it's almost published, hopefully next week. But be patient. You can't use it quite yet. The effective dates will vary by state as they adopt it, and we will have a map on our website tracking state adoption. But in the meantime, I wanted to leave you with, the timeline again in another format. So let's talk about the nicotine exemption, which is less stringent, as we talked about. It's only going to be effective in non-authorized states in August. And in authorized states, it won't be effective until the state adopts it, and they're not required to adopt it. For the more stringent aspects of the rule, the sewer ban will be effective everywhere in 6 months, August 2019. But the rest of Subpart P will only be effective in non-authorized states in August of 2019 and will otherwise have to wait until state adoption. And finally, I want to leave you with our contact information. I would recommend, again, emailing Jessica Young just now. She's out on maternity leave for the next several months. She really didn't want to come back to work after the shutdown. She had her baby the day we were supposed to come back to work. So we congratulate her on her second child, but she is not in the office right now, so hold off on emailing her. But the rest of the team is around. So thank you, and now I think we're going to turn over to Kathy Lett, who is going to be moderating our Q&A session.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Kristen. I'm going to get right into the questions so that we have as much time as possible, but I do just have a couple points, which is that we do have a limited time. We only have till 2:30, so we probably won't be able to address all the questions that were sent in. Thank you, everyone. These are great questions that I've been looking at for the last 70 minutes. We will try to focus on questions that have general applicability, and we won't be able to get into site-specific or waste-specific questions in this forum. So we do apologize for that, but we want to make it as useful an experience for as many people on the phone as we can. Any questions that we don't get to, though, we are going to be reading them all, and we're going to use them to help develop frequently asked questions for our website and for future guidance that we can send out to everyone. So your question will be used. So thank you. I'm going to start right at the top in the same order that the presentation went. So I want to start with, in the effective dates and state authorization section, the question is, what is an authorized state and how do you determine it?
Okay, good question. Basically, almost every single state is an authorized state for the RCRA-based program. The two exceptions are Iowa and Alaska. So every other state is authorized for the base program and therefore implements the RCRA program in lieu of the federal program. And authorized states, when they adopt the program, can be more stringent than the federal program. The federal program is kind of the base program, and states, as they adopt it, can become more stringent, and many do.
Okay, thanks. The next question is, as a federal agency medical center, do I have to wait for the state to adopt subpart P before I can implement it?
Yes.
The next question, we're moving into the nicotine section. So the next question is, just to be clear, on nicotine patches, gums, and lozenges would be not PO 75 only after the states adopt it. Correct, is the question.
That's correct.
Okay. And what is the effective date for those patches to be considered non-hazardous waste? Is a similar question. So there's a question of effective date of the federal rule and then state adoption. So is the effective date for this part of the rule the same as the rest of subpart P federally?
Yes, the difference is that the states aren't required to adopt the nicotine exemption. Right? So it would be effective in non-authorized states in August, but that's only a couple of states. And for the rest of the states, the authorized states have to adopt it. And once the state adopts it, they'll identify the effective date in that state.
Okay. This is one other nicotine question. It's our over-the-counter nicotine, does that also include inhalers and nasal spray and associated packaging?
No, because it's, the rule specifies the 3 different types of OTCs, which are the gums, lozenges, and the patches. Normally, sprays are prescription type nicotine products, and they're not included in the exemption.
Okay. Moving on to the next section of the presentation, which was the reverse distribution and the reverse logistics policy. When does the policy statement portion of the rule take effect?
So for the reverse distribution policy, which refers again to the process where prescription pharmaceuticals are sent to reverse distributors, is codified in subpart P. So that becomes effective in authorized states when the state adopts subpart P. And it becomes effective in non-authorized states 6 months after publication. And it's different for reverse logistics. So again, reverse logistics is a process where non-prescription pharmaceuticals and other unsold retail items are sent to reverse logistics centers. And we did codify this in subpart P, but this actually affirms existing policy at the federal level, so it's effective immediately at the federal level. But again, states can be more stringent, and states have taken a variety of approaches to regulating reverse logistics, so please check with your state on the reverse logistics policy.
The other question in this area that we're going to get to here is, what is the definition of reasonable expectation, and whose reasonable expectation determines if the material is a waste? Is it the healthcare facility's reasonable expectation that you're looking at?
So we have not defined reasonable expectation, but it is a standard that we have relied on for reverse logistics for almost 30 years. And we have included some examples in the definitions of things that we know are not creditable, for example. We'll never get manufacturer's credit. Right? So the idea is the reverse distributor has a function to facilitate manufacturer's credit. We don't want them to turn into a de facto TSDF. Same with a reverse logistics center. Right? So we need to make sure things that aren't clearly known to be waste, broken, leaking, damaged things shouldn't be going to either a reverse distributor or a reverse logistics facility. Those are clearly waste at the healthcare facility and should be managed as such.
Okay, thanks. Moving on to definitions, we had a question out there that I thought would be worth addressing briefly, just to, now that everyone's seen the presentation, going back and explaining the term evaluated. and what we mean by that when we use it in the rule.
Sure. So evaluated pharmaceuticals refers to pharmaceuticals that a reverse distributor has evaluated to see if they'll get manufacturer's credit. So after the reverse distributor receives potentially credible hazardous waste pharmaceuticals from a healthcare facility, they evaluate them and they determine are they going to get credit, and if so, they become evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. Sometimes reverse distributors will receive a potentially credible hazardous waste pharmaceutical from a healthcare facility and realize maybe they don't have a contract with the manufacturer to issue credit and needs to go to another reverse distributor. So in that case, they will remain a potentially credible hazardous waste pharmaceutical, and the reverse distributor can send it on to another reverse distributor.
So I might add to that. I mean, everything Laura said was perfectly fine and accurate. I just might want to, maybe another way of looking at it too is when the reverse distributor gets a potentially credible hazardous waste pharmaceutical, they need to figure out kind of what its next destination is, right? If it's going to another reverse distributor, it's potentially creditable. If it's going on to a TSDF and you know, it's kind of at the end of the road as far as credit evaluation and determination, and it goes to a TSDF, then it starts getting managed that the reverse distributor has an evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceutical at that point.
Okay. Also in definitions, we got a question about long-term care facilities and whether they have to have a DEA registrant present to be a healthcare facility under Subpart P, and another question that talked about a difference in the DEA's definition of long-term care facilities, which includes retirement care facilities, and the one being used in the rule.
I'm not sure I followed the first half of that question, but our definition does differ somewhat. This was a tricky one for us because there is really no standard definition for long-term care facility. So we tried to be consistent with DEA and CMS, as Laura pointed out, but there are some differences still. Even though the revised definition excludes assisted living facilities, it still are some minor differences with DEA. So for our rule, you follow our definition.
Moving on to applicability of the rule, there's a question, has anyone compiled a list of pharmaceuticals that are known to be hazardous waste when disposed? And then specifically, another question, does EPA include chemo drugs in its list of pharmaceuticals?
So yes, people have compiled a list of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. Unfortunately, most of those people charge for that list. So we, a number of years ago, tried to undertake a project to host a website that was a wiki to share that information with people to the extent that we could, you know, to allow people to share that information with each other, I should say. You know, we didn't populate that wiki. We provided the platform for people to share that information with each other. And it was populated, and unfortunately the wiki site that we hosted on is no longer operating wiki, so we have to now take that information and turn it into static information and post it on our website, and we're in the process of doing that right now. So there is that free source of information about which pharmaceuticals are hazardous waste, along with a number of states have posted their own versions of it. Colorado has a good list. Florida has a good list. I believe the state of Washington, as well as the Compliance Assistance Center, the EPA funds through a grant, the HERC website, HERC website, Healthcare Environmental Resource Center, has a list. So, you know, I usually send out links to all of those when people ask me for the list, including the wiki. The wiki is kind of in limbo right now because it's being transitioned over to our website, but we'll get that up soon. Otherwise, there are plenty of vendors out there who I'm sure would be happy to sell it to you.
There's a question about drugs that are hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that are used in a home healthcare setting, and is it are home health agencies held to Subpart P waste disposal requirements if the drugs are disposed of in the home what if they are taken out of the home, presumably by the home health agency?
Yeah, so the criteria for the household hazardous waste exclusion are twofold, and one of them requires it to be generated at the home. So if it's generated at the home, it doesn't matter who generates it, if it's the homeowner or the contractor, home health aide in this case, it can still be considered household hazardous waste.
There's also a question about whether the standards specified in the rule for household waste farms apply to law enforcement agencies doing take-back events.
No, this rule does not apply to law enforcement. It applies to healthcare facilities and reverse distributors, but we did, and just shortly before this rule came out, did a long memo directed towards law enforcement agencies. It came out on it was signed on September 11th of 2018, and that's on our website, and that is our guidance for law enforcement agencies conducting take-back.
Okay, we had a question about pills that are dropped. So if someone drops warfarin on the floor and has to waste it, is that pharmaceutical hazardous waste or P-listed hazardous waste?
Both. So warfarin is a P-listed hazardous waste, and if you drop it on the floor, it would be managed under subpart P, as opposed to P-listed. So P-listed hazardous waste that would have to be managed under subpart P. It would not be a creditable hazardous waste of the floor. What's commonly referred to as floor sweeping, so this once it's been dropped, it's not going to be creditable anymore. It would have to be managed as non-creditable.
Okay, moving on to healthcare facility standards. We got several questions about a nurse's station at an industrial site, whether that falls under subpart P.
Yes, the answer is that that would fall under subpart P, and the nurse facility at that industrial site needs to manage their hazardous waste pharmaceuticals under subpart P.
We also got several questions about healthcare facilities that are LQGs, even if you don't count their pharmaceutical waste. So do those facilities have to put their pharmaceutical waste on the biennial report, and do they need to include it in their contingency plan as an LQG? And also, how do they count the subpart P waste towards their generator status?
There's a lot of questions in there. I will try to take this. The large quantity generator does not count its hazardous waste pharmaceuticals towards determining whether they are large quantity generators, right? So once those pharmaceuticals are managed under subpart P, they're not counting towards their generator status anymore. So a large quantity generator, so a large facility may still be a large quantity generator, but it's not because of their hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, it's because they're non-pharmaceuticals. So think of it in terms of generator status only applies to non-pharmaceutical hazardous waste. Right, so they may still have to do a biennial report, but they will not have to include their hazardous waste pharmaceuticals on that biennial report. And once the pharmaceuticals are managed under subpart P, there is no generator status for those pharmaceuticals.
Okay. Another question that touches on biennial reports: who do facilities submit biennial reports to?
Well, most facilities are going to, are going to end up being in authorized states because most states are authorized, so they'll go to their authorized state, and then the data is federally compiled eventually, but it initially goes to their authorized state. Otherwise, it goes to their region.
Okay. This question is: you stated that only a hazardous waste pharmaceuticals label is required on the containers. However, with the accumulation limit of 1 year, shouldn't the containers also be dated?
We don't require a date on the container, right? I think we're very flexible in how that can be demonstrated. There's a preamble discussion about that.
Okay. And then related to that, are there any provisions for hanging on to that waste for longer than 1 year at facilities that generate very little pharmaceutical waste, like a small rural clinic?
No. There's a storage prohibition against storing for 1 year. Or, excuse me, against storing for more than 1 year, that's statutory.
Okay. Moving on to VSQGs. Let's see, we have a question saying, so a VSQG can send to another VSQG or a SQG, a small quantity generator, as long as they are complying with the new Subpart P standards.
Yeah, so if a VSQG has opted into Subpart P and is acting as a healthcare facility under Subpart P, then they could be a receiving facility and take off the pharmaceuticals from off-site from a different VSQG. There's some conditions associated with that we did not get into during today's presentation, so take a look at the regs and make sure you're familiar with all the conditions associated with that.
Okay. This might be getting to that, so let me know, but the specific question is what requirements are placed on transporters in that consolidation situation?
Well, like the generator consolidation, right? A VSQG doesn't have transporter requirements for VSQG hazardous waste. So there are no transport requirements or tracking requirements for the VSQG waste going off-site to another healthcare facility.
Okay, moving on to the sewer ban. We got several questions regarding can a facility sewer normal saline or pharmaceuticals that are primarily water, such as IV saline solutions. And then another person noted that this is a situation where they're not hazardous, but they are pharmaceuticals.
Right, so the rule technically only applies to hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. So saline presumably would not meet that definition and therefore could be sewered. There are very few pharmaceuticals that I would, very few things that would meet the definition of pharmaceutical that I would feel comfortable sewering because we kind of made a broad statement. We recommend against sewering any pharmaceutical in any setting. Saline might be one of the few exceptions that I can make to that.
And someone else asked, it's my understanding that the DEA requires hospitals to sewer controlled substances. Is that no longer the case?
That's no longer the case.
Okay. Also on DEA-controlled substances, is there a list of DEA-controlled substances that are also RCRA hazardous waste?
Yes, there's a presentation. You'll see the slides, go over that in a minute.
Okay. And let's see, I'm going to hustle through to things that I got last time. Empty warfarin bottles are no longer P-waste? Question mark. I got this question several times about
technically
warfarin.
the empty warfarin, this is a little pet peeve of mine. Technically the empty bottle was never the hazardous waste. It was the residues in the container. But yes, correct. If once all the warfarin pills have been removed, the container residues are no longer hazardous. Both the container and the residues can be discarded as non-hazardous waste. No triple rinsing needed.
Okay. I'm going to jump to reverse distributor standards. I think we have time for maybe one more question. In regard to Section 266-509B, there's a requirement for the reverse distributor to provide confirmation to the healthcare facility upon receipt. What is considered upon receipt?
We don't specify that.
Okay. And then in the shipping section, there's a question about the manifest. Which box on the manifest will farms go into? They offered item 13 or 14.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I think it's 13, because we proposed it as one that it would be, but then we reworked it, and I'm pretty sure it's 13. I'll have to check on that.
Okay.
It says it in the regs what box it is. I just don't remember off the top of my head.
Okay. Again, thank you everyone for your questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to everything. but we will be reading them and using them. So thanks a lot. Okay, well, thank you so much. Let's walk through just a few final reminders before we close out today's live broadcast. I want to thank the over 630 individuals who joined us from all over the country for today's live broadcast. And for those of you who had colleagues emailing me during the live broadcast trying to get in, we do appreciate everybody's patience. We will make a recording from today's delivery available soon. I'm hoping to get it up before the 18th, so next Tuesday. As soon as that recording is available, every person who registered for this event will get a link to it. Every person on the wait list will get a link to it. And every person registered and on the wait list for all future deliveries will get a link to it. So as soon as that archive is available, you will get information, and I encourage you to share it with those that are interested in this topic. As noted, we do have 2 additional deliveries scheduled in March. They are both full to capacity with hundreds of people on the wait list. We are working with the organizers to schedule additional deliveries, and again, we will email all of you once we have additional dates available for registration. If you happen to be registered for one of those future deliveries or on a wait list or know someone who is on a wait list for one of those events and they were able to attend with you today, please help us cancel those unneeded slots so that we can allow others who were not able to join live participate in one of those future deliveries. A number of you are asking for copies of the presentation materials. They are currently available to download from the Seminar Resources page. If you follow the link on the middle right of your screen and click on Seminar Resources and then press Browse to, that link will open up. If you happen to be one of the lucky ones replaying the recorded version of today's archive, those links will still work in the recorded version. So just click the link to the Seminar Resources page and you can download or print out a copy of the slides. The presenters have shared their contact information that's also available on the seminar homepage. And I would ask if each and every one of you could take just a short moment to fill out that online feedback form to let us know what you thought of the delivery today, both in the content they covered as well as our method of delivering it. Another question I get a lot for our webinars, do we offer CEUs or PDHs? The answer is no. However, we do offer participation certificates that are available as soon as you submit your feedback. So if you fill out the feedback form and check the box at the bottom of the feedback form to certify you were here for the whole thing or replayed the whole thing, you will then have access once you submit your feedback to a PDF certificate that you can either print out or download. For those of you who joined together as a group, thank you. You helped us accommodate a much larger audience today, and each of you can fill out the feedback form on your own to get your own certificate, whether you registered individually or not. So feel free to share that link to the feedback form with others who joined you in the same location. Again, today's session was recorded. You will all get an email as soon as that archive is available, and that looks like the end of my reminders. So thank you to the presenters, thank you to all of the participants, and we look forward to hearing from you on a future Internet seminar.